Check, check. Yes. Hi, my name is Yenny. I am the Arts and Humanities intern for We Are Takoma, the City of Takoma Park series that we have here. And today's event is one of the many events that we host. We have many other events that you can check out either on our City of Takoma Park page or on our Facebook page, or feel free to grab a brochure that we have out on the table which lists the events, or to sign up for a weekly e-newsletter. I have the binder, the sign up out there if you want to sign up for that, and you get an email every Tuesday at 3 p.m. of events that we have going on. So I'm going to turn it right over to Julie so she can present herself and her lecture.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. The title of my presentation is Whole Lotta Love, Consensual Non-Monogamy in the 21st Century. I am an associate professor of sociology at Gallaudet University, and also a long-term consensual non-monogamist myself, as I will talk about in this presentation. So I want to start tonight by talking a little bit about the way that relationships in America have been changing. 44% of American adults ages 25 to 34 are neither married nor cohabiting today, which I'm guessing is probably a much larger number than you would have expected. And then I just stumbled across a statistic that actually said that a lot of them were living with their parents. More, in fact, than have ever been living with their parents since they have been taking that type of, collecting that type of information. But even more startling, perhaps, is that a third of adults ages 35 to 49 are likewise unpartnered. So this is not just something that's only happening to the quote-unquote young adults who actually, as far as Americans are concerned, aren't even that young anyway. But the part that really seems to get people is that the median number of lifetime opposite-sex sexual partners for men is going down, which you would never know by reading the media, which loves to talk about Tinder and how everyone's hooking up. But it's actually down to about 6 now, and it's up for women to about 4.2. This is opposite-sex partners only for people ages 25 to 44, which is vastly lower than what most people expect that number to be. Well, I think there are some problems with that statistic. I don't think it's actually as far off as a lot of people assume that it is. However, at the high end of that distribution, which is the people that you hear about and watch in movies, 21% of men have had 15 or more sexual partners, 10% of women have. This, again, is for opposite-sex partners only. The data do technically exist for same-sex partners, but they're hard to come by. All of which is to tell you, I mean, I think that, first of all, American relationships are changing drastically. But most importantly, they don't look much like what you see on TV. I don't think that if you watched American movies and television that you would have any sense at all that this is what is happening in the world today. So given this radically changing landscape, and also the fact that it's changed very quickly, there's a lot of opportunities for us to change the way that we do relationships. Which brings us to tonight's topic of consensual non-monogamy, which I will abbreviate to CNM. Consensually non-monogamous relationships involve participants who do not expect monogamy and have fully consented to some type of non-monogamous arrangement with their partners. This is a broad umbrella term. They vary widely. Most commonly used labels are open, polyamorous, which is usually shortened to poly, and swinging. I'm going to be focusing mostly tonight on poly. If you were hoping to hear a lot about the other two things, I'm sorry. And I just wanted to briefly show you a really funny clip that I think captures some of this disconnect between one generation and the next, although this isn't actually a generational divide here.
Audience, you know, that's what you do. That's what I'll do.
This is the celebrity Anna Kendrick.
The question comes from. That's what I do.
Hi. Hey, gray girl.
Yeah. So first of all, not to make this weird, but you're on my boyfriend's list.
What's up, bro? Hey. How you doing? You doing good? You haven't put a ring on it yet? What's going on?
No, not yet.
Okay. Cool. Cool. Am I on your list? Okay, great. It's good to know I've got options. Thank you.
Wait, can you back? What do you mean on your list? Like how?
Oh.
What do you mean?
He's so cute. Oh, you know your list?
No.
Of like somebody
like
that
favorite actresses?
like somebody that you can sleep with like, you get like a hall pass for like 5 people. It's like 5 people? Yeah.
5 people you can sleep with?
Yeah, if you run into them and
Wait,
the moment
it's like a normal
right.
relationship thing?
Yeah.
You just go like, there are 5 people you can, and then you were like, she's on your list? But like, so you thought you can. I don't understand how this works. No, I mean like, does the list, so do you know who's, like, do you know that you're on lists, or how does that work?
People have made me aware that I'm on lists.
But they don't consult you at all?
I don't have to sleep with him, Trevor.
No, that's why I'm saying it's a bit weird that she's like, just so you know, you're on his list, like it's okay.
No, she's trying to wingman her own boyfriend, and I respect it.
I love that clip, both because it's adorable and also because I think it captures some of the confusion that tends to emerge when people who are not consensually non-monogamous interact with people who are. I just don't even understand. That description of the hall pass is a pretty classic arrangement that people in various types of both swinger and open relationships, it's even a term that emerges within the swinger subculture. So to give a quick overview of consensual non-monogamy, historically, bohemians and intellectuals have been having well-documented C&M relationships for a long time. My favorite being Erwin Schrödinger of Schrödinger's cat fame. He's not the type of person who you're like, oh, I bet he was poly. But in fact, he went around with his legal wife, his sort of wife, who was also with her husband, and he had children with both of them. He has a fascinating life, and if you ever get bored, I strongly recommend reading about it on Wikipedia. Colette, there's a movie out about her right now. Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, also a movie about Frida. Virginia Woolf, Amelia Earhart, Simone de Beauvoir, and Jean-Paul Sartre. The thing that really might stand out to you if you know your history of these people, every one of the women on that list, except maybe possibly, but we're not sure if Amelia Earhart was known to be bisexual. And that's a theme you're going to see running through the rest of tonight. So by the 1970s, there was an actual developed subculture of people called swingers. So you move from this like bohemian lifestyle non-monogamy into something that actually was way more heteronormative and sort of suburban with the swinger subculture. By the late 1970s, the term open relationship had been officially coined, and then it was actually popular by the 80s. But there's never been an open relationship subculture, which makes it very hard to study. And then by the 1990s, Morning Glory Zell Ravenhart, try saying that fast, coined and popularized the term polyamory. And then thus was born polyamorous subculture. This is Morning Glory Zell Ravenhart, photographed with her unicorns. And I just love having like a laser pointer to point at unicorn horns. If you grew up in the 1980s, then you maybe could have gone like I did to Barnum and Bailey's circus and taken for granted that of course there were unicorns in the world. And the reason you were able to do this was because Morning Glory Zell Ravenhart and her husband Oberon decided the world needed a little bit more creativity and spent a fair bit of time breeding goats to have only one horn so that they could have unicorns. They sold them to Barnum and Bailey's circus for a fairly large sum of money and were thus able to fund their polyamorous lifestyle. I'm not making this up. They were a famous pagan priest and priestess, and which thus her costume here. And thus, polyamorous subculture started in the pagan subculture, which many modern polys outside of paganism don't realize. I have never seen documentation of this, but I strongly believe that the reason that the term unicorn, which refers to a bisexual woman who wants to be in a relationship with a man and a woman in an already established relationship, it's a popular term that floats around the poly subculture, I at least love to believe that the reason why that term exists is because they created unicorns in addition to the term polyamory. I don't know that that's true, but I want it to be true. So, important to note here that when they started the polyamorous subculture, she was bisexual, he was straight. They continued to live in a commune in which there were like 3 women and 3 men, and all of the women were in relationships with everybody else, and the men were only in relationships with the women. This is kind of the way that polyamory trickled down, right? It starts with its creators, and it sort of kept going in that general direction. still a theme of bisexual men, bisexual women and straightish men. And it comes from paganism, because that's the people who created polyamory. This is a ridiculously complicated diagram, and I know it's super fuzzy, so you can't really even read it. However, if you put into Google non-monogamy diagrams, it's going to be the first one that comes up. I did not create it. It's by a guy named Franklin Vo, who actually wrote a couple of books on polyamory that I'll mention at the end of the presentation. This diagram is very popular, and if you could actually read it, you would know that it was quite funny. I could actually spend the entire presentation just going through it, because he does a great job of sorting the different types of non-monogamy. But the things I want to draw your attention to for the moment is the way that religious social polygamy, which is the kind of thing you see on TV shows like Sister Wives, right? There's kind of this gap, and if it was more accurate here, it'd be way more like a chasm between that and this polyamorous side of the diagram. And then you know, this swinging thing, and the whole thing mostly is around open relationships. And then there's this thing here that's like cheating, and then this vaguely thing here that's not quite cheating but might be, and all sorts of funny things like convention sex and the 100-mile rule and don't ask, don't tell, and the hall pass thing and everything that we just saw, right? It's a lot of fun. And if you can actually read the things that it says here, you know, which I can't even read it right now, but it has a lot of funny details on there. Nope, it's too fuzzy, sorry. But I strongly encourage you to Google it yourself and read it, because it's quite silly. Other thing that you should notice here is the BDSM part of this, which is huge. So as I will explain throughout the rest of this presentation, there's an enormous overlap between the BDSM subculture and the polyamorous subculture, to the point where it's a little hard to disentangle them. I mean, that would be more like about tying them together, but yes. So next question I want to raise as we contemplate all of this is, are monogamous people really monogamous? So when we talk about changing relationships in America, there are things about modern monogamy that just don't look especially convincing, right? Our statistics are pretty useless about what % of people actually cheat on each other. When you see numbers on this, you generally just shouldn't believe them, because it's very hard to define cheating, and people aren't telling the truth. And really, if they're the kinds of people who would cheat on somebody, are they the kind of people who tell the truth on a survey? Like, there's a lot of reasons why you can't really get good numbers on this. But we have good enough numbers to know that most men in ostensibly monogamous relationships, statistically speaking, are at least looking at porn, which I think gets a little fuzzy on that monogamy thing. And then a lot of women are too. And statistically speaking, a very substantial percentage of people will just straight up admit to having cheated on somebody, right? I mean, and the number of people who were, well, mostly men, but the number of people who were on Ashley Madison before it collapsed was not small, if you are familiar with the famous hack of Ashley Madison, which was a website designed for cheaters. So when we study them, monogamous people don't even seem to be very clear about what constitutes cheating. And famously, they'll do things like be like, well, it's not cheating if I do it, but it'd be cheating if my partner did it. And then they get really like funny about men versus women on this. So they're not even very good at deciding what constitutes cheating. But my favorite, most damning statistic is actually from a very recent book I encourage you to read, called Tell Me What You Want. It was just published this summer, which looked at sexual fantasies with not with a representative sample of Americans, but with a very large number of people. And he found that the most popular sexual fantasies in America are about group sex, with the majority of people, the actual statistical vast majority, having fantasized about threesomes, orgies, and gangbangs. This was true for both men and women. 79% of men and 62% of women specifically fantasized about being in a C&M relationship. This wasn't people who were in one. These are people fantasizing about being in one. So for all that they say that they're monogamous and they want to be monogamous, a lot of people are fantasizing about consensual non-monogamy, both in terms of the actual having sex that way and also the being in the relationship that way. But if we go and we start asking people with more representative samples, it's slightly different information. So YouGov actually did a poll that is nationally representative and found that 14% of Americans had been in some sort of open relationship. That's for adults. But among people under 30, 22% have, which is a pretty high percentage. Of all adults currently in relationships, though, only 3% of men and 1% of women say they are currently in some sort of open relationship. 36% of men and 16% of women say that C&M is morally acceptable. It's kind of a chasm there for the genders. There's also a pretty big racial chasm in that one, too, with 30% of whites saying that C&M is acceptable, but only 13% of blacks and 14% of Hispanics. So it's not entirely surprising if you go out as a sociologist and you look at polyamorous communities, you tend to see that they are predominantly white. And some of that is related. I see these numbers divided up by race. I think to a large degree here, race is a proxy for religion, because very religious people, especially very religious Christians, are much less likely to consider consensual non-monogamy to be acceptable. On a scale from 0 to 6, where 0 is, I think 0 there is like completely non-monogamous, or is completely monogamous, and 6 is completely non-monogamous. 61% of Americans said their ideal relationship would be completely monogamous, while 7% said it would be completely non-monogamous. So 7%, just to give you a sense of how large a figure that is, it's about 3 times the number of Jews in America. So it's a pretty substantial percentage of the population who say that at least hypothetically they would like to be in a completely non-monogamous relationship. And then everyone in between there was saying that they wanted something that was in between completely monogamous and completely non-monogamous. Go back to that number of 3% of men and 1% of women currently in a non-monogamous relationship, and you go, how can that be? Well, the answer, of course, is LGBTQ, right? So part of the story, a very big part of the story, is about lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender, and queers. C&M relationships have been common among gay men for a very, very long time. This has been well documented. They're kind of normative in gay culture. But polyamory, interestingly, has not been so popular there. In terms of like the modern day, it's much more popular among the bear subculture and also among pagan gay men as well. But in terms of like normative polyamory in gay culture, not so much. But at the same time, normative monogamy, not so much. C&M never seems to have been especially popular among lesbians. But C&M, especially polyamory, thrives most among bisexuals and those who love them. So there's an unfortunately tragically bad data set analysis. Well, the good data set and a bad analysis. I think the statistic might be true. They basically found that gays and lesbians were twice as likely to have been in an open relationship as heterosexuals. Bisexuals were twice as likely as gays and lesbians. So I take that with a huge grain of salt, because their numbers have a lot of problems. But there's a lot of reason to believe that polyamory is most popular among bisexuals of everyone in that LGBTQ acronym. C&M seems to be quite popular among queer-identified people as well as trans people, but often not as polyamory, so something in between that 0 and 6 number, right, from the previous survey. And just to give you a sense of that, I have this hilarious bit with Dan Savage, who's a famous sex advice columnist and gay.
It can be a religious ceremony or not. It's up to that couple. That institution, as straight people practice it, as straight people redefine it, there's no logical case that can be made to exclude gay couples, monogamous or not, from an institution that doesn't exclude straight couples, monogamous or not.
Have you had extramarital affairs?
It depends. Is it adultery if I'm committing it at one end of a guy and he's committing it at the other end of that same guy?
Party.
What?
Tailgate party.
Go Packers.
Go Packers. Table saw.
Woodworking.
Paella.
Paella?
Chainsaw.
Chainsaws. Now, you say that.
This is my favorite moment on the entirety of the Colbert Report. It's all the way back from 2011, before gay marriage was legal. But I just love Stephen Colbert losing his character. All of which is to say, yes, like among gay men, consensual non-monogamy has been pretty normative for a long time. However, I'm not really going to talk about that tonight very much, and there actually aren't that many studies on it, sadly enough. What I am going to talk about way more is in terms of polyamory and subcultures. So these days, CNM and polyamory in particular thrives the most in the pansexual BDSM, which stands for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, sadism, and masochism subculture. There is an adjacent polyamorous subculture, but tends to be much more settled, and the people in it tend to have a lot more children, which I think keeps them from going out as much. So somewhat paradoxically, the public face of consensual non-monogamy, much more than this, well, it's not the media's face, but the people who are the most active, both sort of politically and socially in terms of consensual non-monogamy, are actually the people in the BDSM subculture rather than the people who are in this polyamorous subculture, which I know lots of poly people who literally don't know that it exists. It's very small, it has very few events, there's occasional meetups, but it's strangely hard to keep together, whereas the BDSM subculture is very well developed, has lots of social networking, and a very strong social and political presence. There's also a very, very large polyamorous and consensual non-monogamy presence within the pagan subculture. There's sort of a dwindling swinger subculture. It's definitely still around, but it is shrinking. So I'm an academic of technology, other researchers. If you're interested in that polyamorous subculture, I encourage you to read Elizabeth Sheff's The Polyamorous Next Door. She specifically studied polyamorous families with children. Terry Gold wrote about the erotic rights of swingers. And then there's also a woman who's part of a research team named Terry Conley, and she's a psychologist who's done a lot of work on consensual non-monogamy, and particularly perceptions of consensual non-monogamy. No books, but she's written a lot of articles. But I'm going to spend the rest of tonight talking about my own research because I'm here. And so I'm going to talk about polyideology in the BDSM subculture because I think that it is most interesting to imagine what consensual non-monogamy and polyamory in particular will look like if it actually succeeds in trickling down to mainstream culture. And for all intents and purposes, polyamory in the BDSM subculture did in fact trickle down into the BDSM subculture via the pagan and polyamorous subcultures originally. At this point, it's just bigger there than it is in those other places, which is also really interesting to note. The BDSM subculture at this point is actually polynormative in the sense that everyone there kind of expects people to be non-monogamous. And I think that focusing on it really just gives us a lot of ideas about where this might go. But it is noticeable that this term pansexual here is a little bit misleading. So when I talk about the pansexual BDSM subculture, I'm talking about a group of people who are predominantly not straight women and straightish men. The name is somewhat misleading in that respect. So this is basically the BDSM subculture that isn't gay men's BDSM subculture. But the notable thing there is the strong presence of bisexuals. So there isn't a well-defined bisexual subculture in America. And one of the closest places that you can get to a well-defined bisexual subculture in America is the BDSM subculture, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But there you have it. So I actually did a big survey of people in the BDSM scene about all this. And for people with high levels of scene involvement, only 4% of people in the BDSM subculture, which is people who are involved in the public BDSM subculture, right? Not people who do kink privately. But of those people who were highly involved in the BDSM subculture, only 4% of them wanted a totally monogamous relationship. 17% said they wanted a sexually monogamous relationship, but one where they were still allowed to engage in BDSM play with other people. I think that notion is foreign to people outside of the BDSM subculture in general because they're like, but how would that even be monogamy? But in the BDSM subculture, that's a not unheard of idea. I think it actually speaks to how polynormative the BDSM subculture is that people would still call that monogamy there. 68% of them say they want a polyamorous relationship, and 16% want a swinger or open relationship. So the vast majority of those with high levels of involvement expect non-monogamy. And if I look for those with medium involvement, which is closer to the median, these numbers are still very high. So when I talk about polynormativity, I mean this expectation of non-monogamy, which is weird because there's absolutely nothing about BDSM and polyamory that inherently have anything to do with one another. But to talk to modern kinksters, you would never know this. And so I thought that it would be pretty interesting to go in depth and try to find out why it is that people expect polyamory within the BDSM subculture. Most particularly, I'm going to spend the rest of my talk talking about the values that are associated with giving up monogamy, right? So if we imagine that there's this trickle down like consensual non-monogamy from polyamorous subculture, and it goes down through the BDSM subculture, and then I'm sort of imagining maybe someday it might trickle down into the rest of mainstream culture. I want to imagine what kind of values are going to come through that strange processing. So the first one, which I think mostly has been given up, is the idea of polyamory as an orientation. In the polyamorous subculture, it's a very popular explanation to say that some people are just born this way. Some people are born poly, some people are born monogamous. That's how they are. I have to say, for myself, I continue to find this explanation very appealing at the same age that lots of gays and lesbians say that they first realized they were gay when I was 5. I thought, gosh, I never want to be monogamous. That sounds terrible. And I never had any particularly strong feelings about my own sexual orientation the way that people usually describe that. I don't have particularly strong feelings about gender and attraction that way. I have very strong feelings about polyamory, though, and I always have. So for me, this explanation was always very personally appealing. But it's interesting that it's really not so popular within the BDSM subculture these days. I'm seeing more people now talking about, in addition to that, there's maybe polyflexible identity, people who could be poly or could be monogamous. In general, born this way polys will say things like monogamy never made sense to them, they were never comfortable with it when they tried it, or they didn't try it at all, right? And so there are people who I think reflect that this is a reality, but very, very few people that I interviewed in the BDSM subculture said that polyamory was something that they were born. However, they did invoke language like, you can love more than one person at one time. So this is absolutely something that came down from the polyamorous subculture and made its way quite heartily into the BDSM subculture. I'm going to show you several memes here that are polyamorous memes that I think reflect some of these attitudes. So love is love no matter how many partners you have, right? That's part of the ideology of you can love more than one person at a time. So polys often draw parallels to other types of love, particularly familial love, to challenge the idea that romantic love is exclusive to one person. They're like, what, I can't love my mom and my dad, right? Like, if I can love my mom and my dad, why can't I also love two people in a romantic way, right? Or I can love my mom and I can love my children, and it doesn't lessen how much I love either of them, so why would it lessen my love to have two husbands? And they often describe themselves almost like connoisseurs of love. So they'll describe different types of love and different relationships with different people in this very positive language of, I have lots of different people and I get to experience love in all these different ways. Another idea that came down pretty hard from polyamorous subculture is gender equality and fairness. So I love this meme. When polyamorous people watch romantic movies, they'd be like, just be poly. All right, so for polyamorous people, they're often like, especially on social media, there'll be a lot of jokes about like watching some show where there's this love triangle. And there's like, why is this the plot? Right? Why can't you just have both and move on, right? And it's the having both is an important concept here, right? There's a general assumption that everyone gets to have multiple partners. So even within the BDSM subculture, where a lot of times there's a dominant, they are, and there's a person who's a submissive, there's even still then an expectation the submissive is allowed to have multiple dominants. And in fact, the subculture mocks people who occasionally do appear who make arrangements where the dominant is allowed to have multiple submissives, but the submissive is only allowed to have the one dominant. I have lots of people mocking that, although I had people who were in that arrangement. But there's a general assumption that everybody gets to have multiple partners, and there's also an assumption that women and men both want to have multiple partners, which is, I think, a pretty strong separation from the mainstream culture, which tends to assume that it's men who want this, not women, right? In fact, ironically, especially within the BDSM subculture among people I interviewed, there's generally an assumption that bisexuals are getting more out of this than monosexuals. Bisexuals are far more likely to be women in that subculture. I mean, they're more likely to be women statistically everywhere. And so there's actually an assumption that women would want this even more than men, because if you're bisexual, of course you must want to have multiple partners. Which is interesting, seeing that assumption within the subculture. In fact, I never heard a single person question that assumption. But when you go interview bisexuals outside of that subculture, they're like, I can be monogamous, I can. And just because I love women or men doesn't mean that I can't just love one person at a time. The statistical majority of bisexuals identify as monogamous. You'd never know that talking to people in the BDSM subculture. In general, people within this polynormative subculture assume if you're bisexual, of course you want to have multiple partners. Another meme, went for a romantic walk on the beach because when all four of us hold hands, we don't fit on the sidewalk. Which is part of another aspect of this ideology that says it's not a competition, right? Multiple partners aren't supposed to be about having someone that you're competing against. Metamor is a polyamorous subcultural term for a partner's other partners. So like your husband's girlfriend would be your metamor. And so sometimes people become extremely good friends with these people. Like, contrary to how a lot of people might assume of like, oh, these are like your enemies, right? A lot of times, in fact, they're friends. They all live together in the same house. They coordinate things like, oh, partner is having trouble with X. Let's both make sure that we do things to try to make sure that he, is able to remember to eat on time or whatever. One of the people I interviewed, a lot of Kinksters, and so one of them said, it's not a competition. They're, metamors, your teammates. If you're doing it right, they are there to help more than anything else. Right? So it's a radical departure from the way the mainstream culture views the idea of your partner's other partners. In keeping with this is this wonderful comic. I actually have a friend who was in a restaurant where he got up to go to the bathroom, and his wife and her boyfriend were sitting at the table, and the waiter tells him, as he's coming out of the bathroom, he's like, I hate to break this to you, but while you're in the bathroom, I saw your wife kissing that other guy. And he's like, you have to be joking. So then he goes up to the guy and he's like, you betrayed me, just to like mess with the waiter. Yeah. So another poly meme, this one's less funny, but I think captures a lot of the attitudes I see in the BDSM subculture. Jealousy stems from insecurity. Deep self-reflection and communication is the solution. The polyamorous subculture, in general, and the BDSM subculture especially, has an extremely ambivalent relationship with jealousy. So many poly people will tell you that they're not naturally jealous, and that they only experience jealousy when they're insecure in their relationship. And people will use these almost exact same words over and over again in interviews, right? This is something that comes into polyamorous discourse over and over again. So the idea says, jealousy isn't a natural feeling, at least for me. The only reason that I will feel jealous is if I'm not sure about X, right? I'm not sure that you want to stay with me. I'm not sure that you want to spend time with me, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea behind that is that communication will solve this problem, right? Thus, deep self-reflection, you sit around and you ponder it, and communicate with your partners. That's how you solve this problem. If you go to polyamorous workshops, this is the kind of stuff they'll teach you. At the same time, I talked with lots of poly people who say that they do get jealous and that it takes work to get over it. And when I teach workshops to people on how to be and do polyamory in the BDSM subculture, I usually find that about half the people who come to my workshops say they don't get jealous, and about half of them say that they do. But the poly community in general tends to shame jealousy. And when I ask those people who get jealous, I'm like, do you feel like the community is supportive of you? They're like, no, this is not something the polyamorous community is very comfortable with. And in fact, they spend a lot of time distinguishing between jealousy and envy. And jealousy is supposed to be about possession. Like, I don't want you to have my person, and so I am jealous of them. Whereas envious is, I want to be out doing that cool thing with that person too, and I'm sad that I'm not there to do that thing with them. People spend a lot of energy on making that distinction. There was a word termed compersion, which is supposed to be the opposite of jealousy. It was popular in the polyamorous subculture. I have not heard it much in the BDSM subculture. Basically, there's this fantastical idea of, when I am out and I am doing a thing, I am happy knowing that my husband is home with his girlfriend, and I feel compersion, which is the opposite of jealousy, and I feel pleased that they are having a great sex life or whatever, right? And again, when I teach workshops in polyamory, I'm like, how many of you have really experienced this emotion? And I generally find very small numbers of people who say that they have, which I think is part of why it's not nearly as popular of a concept as it once was. But it used to be like kind of pushed on people a bit. The way I like to tell people about it is that I don't think I've rarely experienced anything that I could purely call compersion. But that said, I feel much the same about my husband being with his girlfriend doing things that I don't like to do that I feel about him forging knives, which is something that he loves to do, hammer metal things with his friends. I don't like to do that either, and I'm happy that he is happy and he has people to hammer knives with, just like I am happy that he is happy with his girlfriend. And if that is compersion, then that is compersion, and if it is not, then I don't even know what it is. But then also it's the poly mantra of communicate, communicate, communicate. And I've seen jokes, although I couldn't actually find any memes for them, that says swingers have sex, polys have conversations. So like basically that polyamory is all about talk, talk, talk. All right. The other thing that almost never do I hear people frame in these terms is the emphasis on individualism, although people talk about needs all the time. So there's a general belief that people have a right to have their personal needs and wants satisfied, emotionally, sexually, and otherwise. It's a baseline assumption of polyamorous practice and subculture. And sociologists typically distinguish between this perspective and a more family-oriented perspective. So you can contrast this pretty harshly to the ways that, say, Mormons or Amish people will talk about their family lives, where the family is the important thing, right? What you need and want should come second or third or fourth even to what the family as a group or a unit needs. In polyamorous ideology, particularly that in the BDSM subculture, there's a very strong assumption that every individual has a right to have those needs, wants, and desires met, and that they are allowed to go out and get them. In fact, that they should. And related to that is this very individualistic orientation towards relationships. So one of my respondents, Lily, says, I really want the people that I'm with to be independent and be with me because they actually want to be, not out of some sense of obligation or history or anything like that. It's a pretty far cry from a traditional attitude about marriage, childbearing, buying a house together, right? Like, this is way more based on the idea of relationships for relationships' sake than relationship for family, genealogy, economics, etc. sake. And even more, one of my respondents, Lucy, said, the more I learned about things being in the BDSM scene, there's just so many different variations. I mean, I could have a romantic sexual relationship with one person, but they might not be able to engage in BDSM play the way I want to play, so then I could play with somebody else and do those things with them. And maybe there's somebody else that I can do those cool BDSM things with. So it really seems to fit and work and make a lot more sense If I could find one person that we wanted to settle down and play house together, I'm open to that also. I just think it's kind of, for me at least, it's unrealistic to think that one person could fulfill all my needs. And that phrase, one person could fulfill all my needs, is one that showed up again and again in my research. It's going to be a huge part of the way that the BDSM subculture in particular practices polyamory. So I found this meme. It says, I'm sorry, I can't read the top there. It says, I do not cheat. I do not lie. I am not easy. I do not sleep around. I love bigger and deeper than most. My heart is simply too big for any one person to fill. I am poly. I am love. There's a lot to unpack in that meme, but I think it encapsulates a lot of what I see in polyamorous subculture all over the place, right? There's a big emphasis on not cheating, which I know you can't read, on telling the truth, communicating openly and honestly. There's also kind of a big emphasis on the idea that poly is not about sex and that it is in fact about love. This shows up even in the BDSM subculture where people have a lot of sex. So I heard people using phrases like, it's more than just sex. I would even go so far as to say that there is an undercurrent of sex negativity or downplaying in a lot of poly discourse. So this is especially, and it shows up even among people who do sleep around a lot. So for example, one of my respondents, Connor, says that he wishes that he could tell people, could respond, because people will say things like, oh, so you identify as poly because you fuck all these people. And I'm like, no, I fuck all these people, and I happen to also have multiple relationships. And then goes on to say, imagine saying, actually, I'm not dating that person at all. We're just event fuck buddies. I mean, that is a relationship called buddy, but it's not a capital R relationship in my lexicon. So this is somebody who's identifying as polyamorous pretty strongly, but also saying, yeah, I like to sleep around, but that's not what polyamory is. And I had a lot of people say that. And I think that part of why that problem happens, especially in the BDSM subculture, is that on some level people understand that there is this thing that I call polysexuality, which is not the same as polyamory. Polysexuality means you want to have sex with a lot of people. Polyamory means you want to be in relationships with a lot of people. But the term polysexual never caught on, in part just because people just almost always shorten it to poly. And I think it causes a lot of confusion ultimately in the subculture. I'll be very interested to see if that ever, ways that may or may not trickle down. The last thing I think that shows up a lot is the idea that monogamy just doesn't work. So dissing monogamy tends to be a hobby in polyculture. People love to tell these stories, they like poke fun at monogamous people, and they'll like say that monogamy is actually monotony, right? And one of my respondents, Elaine, said, I think that human relationship dynamics are way too complex to have just one person. It seems so unnatural to me. Why would you give in to this almost puritanical notion of self-denial? I'm not a Puritan. Most of the people I sleep with are not Puritans, so why would we follow their bullshit rules? Like, this is framing monogamy in actual literal terms of self-denial and it being unnatural, right? And you'll often hear polys say that monogamous people will just inevitably cheat and get divorced. So there's this strong sense of monogamy is failure, right? And oftentimes poly people, especially in the scene, will have stories about a monogamous marriage or like a long-term relationship that failed, and that oftentimes even precipitated what got them into the scene in the first place. And then now they've learned their lesson and they've become polyamorous. Which all culminates in what I like to sort of sarcastically refer to as the polytocracy. So this is a sarcastic meme from a polyamorous meme. It's that rare moment when you can't text any of your 3 girls because they are all spending time with their other partners. Polyamorous people, especially in the BDSM subculture, tend to be, in the words of a monogamous person I know in the BDSM subculture, smug. Which is to say that they frame polyamory as something that is achieved rather than something that they were born with. And the way that I like to jokingly advertise this is to say, if you know yourself well, recognize that jealousy is just a manifestation of insecurity, learn to communicate well with your partners, manage your time well, trust yourself and your partners, believe that monogamy is an archaic and generally sexist relationship construction, and subscribe to a very individualistic relationship philosophy, you too can join the cool kids club. And this is to a large degree what is preached within the BDSM subculture at this point. It's not the idea that some people are born poly and some people are born monogamous, but instead that if you work really hard, you too can be that cool. Which is why I use the term polytocracy there, which is a reference to the idea of meritocracy, right? Where if you work really hard, then you'll become rich. Here is where if you work very hard, you will become rich in partners, basically. I'm not 100% personally convinced that it is actually that easy. I see a lot of people succeed with this, but I also see a lot of people fail. I definitely think that it results in the smug attitude that the monogamous person was critiquing. There's a popular shirt in the BDSM subculture that says, "Your fantasy is my reality," which is literally true, right? We saw the most popular fantasy in America is consensual non-monogamy. So at the point where you have manifested that fantasy, you can fairly say your fantasy is my reality. However, it does definitely have a certain smug attitude to it. So we think about what might happen if we trickle this down further, right, beyond the BDSM subculture. I wonder, like, can CNM work well outside of subcultures? Statistically speaking, open relationships don't seem to work as well as polyamorous subcultures based on a single study that looked at this, but I think the answer is ultimately yes, but role models are essential. I don't think almost everyone that I interviewed who was engaging in polyamory of any sort, they're like, yeah, I met these people and then I saw that they were doing it and then it seemed possible. Even for myself, I had planned to be poly from the age of 5, and when I met my first boyfriend, who is now my husband, when I was 17, I was like, I could never be monogamous, and he said, great, me either, and then we were functionally monogamous for 10 years until we met other people who were doing it. It was very hard to do without role models. And so I think that role models are huge for that, and there certainly aren't any right now in literature, right? Like who are your polyamorous literary role models? They are few and far between. So to really have a conception of how to do polyamory or consensual non-monogamy in general from either fiction or generally even from the people around us. I think that the jealousy shaming probably has to go. This has been a feature of polyamorous culture for a while, and I think that if it's gonna grow out, it probably has to start getting more comfortable with the idea that people can be jealous and do consensual non-monogamy. And while I hear people say it all the time, and I often hear poly presenters be like kind of defensive, say, yeah, it's fine to be jealous, I don't actually get that sense from the subculture still. And so I feel like that there have to be more incorporation of jealousy as a thing that happens in consensually non-monogamous relationships in order for them to really be part of a larger culture. I think having a social support network is essential. It's not just role models, right? It's people that you can go to and complain because inevitably you're going to have trouble, right? Just like with any relationship. And if you go to a bunch of monogamous people when you're having trouble as a polyamorous person, the monogamous people tend to say, well, maybe you should just stop, right? And they don't have good solutions for that. Whereas if you have a social support network of people who are also poly, they go, yeah, I had that problem with my partners and here's what we did to fix it. Or alternatively say, yeah, that was a bad day, I'm sure it'll be fine, right? And it's a very different social support network from the social support network that says, solve your problem by being monogamous. I think that casual CNM doesn't require nearly as much for this, but polyamory absolutely does, right? So if you just want to be able to occasionally have threesomes with your long-term partner, there is a lot less talking and social support and role modeling that has to go into that. It's really more, the closer you get from that 0 was the fully monogamous and the 1 is a little bit, right? The further you get towards that 6 of the completely non-monogamous, I think the more you need in terms of social support. Ironically, though, I'm finding that polynormative pressures within the BDSM scene are actually making it less supportive for newer folks there. I've been talking to quite a number of younger people who got into the BDSM subculture, which is just straight up polynormative now. And they were like, yeah, I mean, I'd never even thought about polyamory, but like I started dating this guy and he already had a girlfriend, so I guess I'm poly now, but you know, it's not working out so great. And I think actually there comes a point where, especially when you're talking about a mainstream culture that is very monogamous, you step into a subculture where you didn't even come there expecting non-monogamy at all, right? Like there's kind of a chasm that you got to walk across there. So I don't know that polynormativity is necessarily always helpful either without some broader social context for supporting it. People have to arrive there gradually rather than, you know, being thrown out of an airplane into it. And right now our culture doesn't actually provide a lot of support for it. Also, it's worth noting that even in the BDSM subculture, it's very unpopular with Christians. So on my survey, by far, the thing most likely to predict not being non-monogamous is being Christian. And there are not many Christians in the BDSM scene, I hasten to add, right? It's a very non-religious and pagan subculture. But even within that subculture, being Christian makes people much less likely to be consensually non-monogamous. So it's hard to imagine it catching on with Christians in mainstream culture for now, but I mean, the statistics show the culture is becoming much less religious very quickly. So I can imagine as a sociologist that as we become less religious, we also might become less monogamous. I wondered whether or not I should actually end this presentation on this note, but this is not me being a sociologist so much as this is me being a person. And I cannot help speculating whether or not polyamory might be able to save lives. And I know that sounds really dramatic, but 2 weeks ago, last week, was Bisexual Visibility Week. And they are the most invisible part of the LGBTQ acronym a lot of times. Most people are unaware that bisexuals have by far the highest rate of both mental illness and suicide and suicidal ideation in the LGBTQ acronym. There's a 2010 Canadian study that found that bisexuals are about 6 times as likely to consider suicide as heterosexuals versus 4 times as likely for lesbians and gays. This is so true that there have actually been a few people, activists, who have suggested that when we talk about LGBTQ suicide, we're actually misrepresenting what's happening. That bisexuals are so much more likely to be killing themselves. That we actually need to be focusing on this as a thing in and of itself. And when I first read those statistics, I was pretty horrified. And I was like, my people, why are they killing themselves? And I thought for a minute, because I've never thought about killing myself. And I thought, if I had to be vanilla and monogamous, how would I feel? And it took me less than 10 seconds to arrive at the conclusion that I would want to kill myself. And I don't say that lightly, right? I mean that completely seriously. If someone told me that, you know, I would die, they would kill me if I had to be, if I was not vanilla, and if I was not monogamous, I feel like I would kind of be like, I mean, that's a fair question, right? Like death or that. That's how deep that is for me. And I wonder if there aren't a lot of bisexuals who perhaps are in the same boat, trying desperately to be monogamous, trying desperately to fit into this world where historically consensual non-monogamy has thrived the most among bisexuals. And, you know, if they, of course they can be monogamous, right? It's just a question of whether or not they should have to be. And I also feel like it's worth pointing out that biologically speaking, we know next to nothing about bisexuals. All the research that you see about like biological gay versus biological straight, right? There's nothing about biologically bisexual. And I can't help but wonder if maybe we're wired differently. Maybe we are less qualified to do monogamy. And I'm sure that there will be some bisexuals who are going to watch this and comment underneath that I'm a horrible person, that I'm undoing all this bisexual activism that promises that bisexuals can in fact be monogamous. And I say bisexuals can be monogamous, but maybe the problem is that they shouldn't have to be. And maybe it's somewhat a dramatic way to end this, which is why I'm going to go instead to say, move on to resources for interested folks. famous book, The Ethical Slut, More Than Two. That's by the guy who did that great poly diagram, Rewriting the Rules, Stories from the Polycule. I actually have a story in there myself. Love Unlimited, The Art and Etiquette of Polyamory, Opening Up, Tristan Taormino's famous book, Polyamory, Roadmaps for the Clueless and Hopeful, which I think is an adorable title. And my own blog slutphd.com, all can give you resources for how to do polyamory if you are interested. That concludes the lecture portion of my presentation. I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.